Welcome to the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley, psychology student and international best-selling psychology author of over 30 psychology books, bringing you the latest psychology news, fascinating psychology topics and more each week. If you want to learn more, then please check out connorwhiteley.net/books. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the YouTube video or follow on your favourite podcast app. And here's the show. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 345 of the Psychology World podcast with me, Connor Whiteley. And today's podcast episode is on what happens after surviving a suicide attempt. And it is Friday the 19th of September 2025 as I record it. So before we dive into today's podcast episode and what it covers, I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. In today's podcast episode, we do talk about suicide. So if this is going to trigger you, or if you got younger listeners around you, but like younger children or people who this isn't appropriate for, then please look after yourself, practice some self-care. Make sure that you're in the right mental head space. Most importantly, please come back to this podcast episode later on when you're feeling better. I don't want this to trigger you. I don't want this to cause you any mental distress. Even though this podcast episode does contain a lot of great information. Just please look after yourself. You are important. So today's podcast episode is really good. It's really fascinating. And I really enjoyed learning about it because, as I've mentioned on the podcast, in 2024, I did do 3 suicide attempts, and now I'm actually really glad that they failed, that they were unsuccessful attempts, because as I also talk about in today's podcast episode, there's so many great reasons why I'm alive, and even just to keep it positive, like even today. So I'm recording this at 2 in the afternoon. So today I saw my granddad for the first time in a while. So that was a good thing. It was lovely talking to him. I was able to make quite a good bit of headway on a project before I went to go and see him. I helped mow his lawn. I also finished a really good book last night that I really enjoyed reading. It was not one of my favourite seasons. And today, and the weather is actually beautiful outside, and it's basically a summer day in late September. So even though they're really small reasons, I'm still really happy. And if my suicide attempts were successful, I wouldn't be able to experience that joy. Therefore, in today's podcast episode, we're going to talk about what happens after a suicide attempt. So this also includes, how does a suicide survivor feel? So are they happy, sad? Are they depressed? Are they relieved? So we explore those questions. But then we also talk about what can those around them, like the friends and family members of the loved one, do to support them after a suicide attempt. And also, what can the individual do themselves? Who, as the suicide survivor, so can they reach out to mental health support? What are some of the short-term and some of the long-term techniques that they can use to support their mental health? So it's a brilliant podcast episode. I really enjoyed it and I learned a lot. And you actually hear this in today's podcast episode, but I also realised a few things about my suicide attempts and why I went on to do a second and third attempt. And that all came down to the people around me. So just some food for thought. So you've got that to look forward to on the content part of today's episode. But before we dive into that, moving on to the psychology news section, we're reading from the British Psychological Society Research Digest. And the first one is, depersonalization changes how we see ourselves, literally. If you were asked to picture your own face in your mind's eye, could you do it? Most of us should find this fairly straightforward, but then most of us have a relatively consistent sense of attachment to our physical body. For people suffering from depersonalization disorder, though, that sense of connection is more variable and often more distant. Depersonalization entails feelings of detachment from the self and the body. In extreme cases, those with the condition may report feelings like an automaton, and if they're living in a dream or a movie. This physical detachment extends to their own faces. Open quote. Looking at my face in the mirror feels like an uncomfortable staring contest with a total stranger. Close quote. As one person with depersonalization has written. In their latest paper published in Cognition, people from Bangor University and the University of Lisbon explored the specifics of how those prone to depersonalization see their own faces and interoceptive factors that shape those perceptions. So I won't dive into the article any more than that, and whilst it's not a great amount because depersonalization is something I've covered before on the podcast in relation to psychosis, but either I do not remember it or I've not researched it in enough depth for me to be able to say something meaningful. But this is still important for us to look at, because you might think depersonalization, it doesn't impact that many people, it's not the main bread and butter of the National Health Service here in the UK, and surely we should be focusing our attention on depression and anxiety, as these are some of the most common mental health conditions. And there might be an argument for that, but still, as aspiring or qualified clinical psychologists, considering our job or our future job is to help decrease psychological distress, improve lives, and give people more adaptive coping mechanisms to deal with life's stresses, even if one person experiences a mental health condition like depersonalization, that should be enough for us to care, be interested, and want to invest time, energy, and research to be able to understand them. But another factor that we can consider is that if we understand how depersonalization works and what makes, say, a person disconnect and feel distant from their body, then we can understand how the process works in people without the condition, and this can push our knowledge forward in terms of how clinically normal people can understand this. So it's really good research, and I'm glad that we're focusing on it. So the second one is Dream Database aims to answer burning questions. Why do some people wake up every morning with detailed memories of their dreams, whilst others can't remember dreaming at all? Why do so few people have lucid dreams which they can control? And more fundamentally, how can we spot when someone is dreaming by looking at the brain activity alone? Despite decades of research into dreams, we still don't have answers to these big questions. That's partly down to inconsistent methods, and because of the high costs involved, the often small number of participants included in the experiment. Right, a team led by William Wong at a university in Australia in natural communications. In a bid to overcome the two stumbling blocks, the team has now established the Dream Database, a new and expanding collection of standardized data sets of both measures in brain activity during sleep and accompanying dream reports. Oh wow, okay, this sounds brilliant. Oh my god, okay, so there are a few things I want to unpack here. So, first of all, go open science, because I think this is an example of open science. This is what we need to be doing. We need to be releasing our databases, our data sets, just so other people can combine them. Because when these data streams, when these databases are combined, we are able to create more statistically powerful sample sizes. We're also able to create better studies with more participants, more data sets, so we're able to support our conclusions. And he's absolutely right. These studies are so expensive. Like, I would flat out love to do a neuroimaging study though, especially when it comes to functional MRI images. I would love to do that study, but it's so expensive. So the very fact that if we can combine lots of smaller scale studies into one big study sample, that's going to give us a lot of statistical power, a lot of data points to draw our conclusions from. So it's really good that we've got standardized data sets and the accompanying dream reports. Like, I know for the past few nights I have been dreaming, but I've only got lucid memories, like very lucid memories of these dreams, and they're to do with my former housing situation and all the emotional abuse that I went through. So I think that this is going to be very interesting if you're doing dream research. Maybe try and add your data to this database. But I think in the future, this could be really powerful, really useful, and a lot of great research could come from it. But as a final point, is that now that we've got this dream database idea, could we do this for other sort of scientific inquiries in psychology? For example, could any clinical psychology measures do this? So, in the first psychology news article, we were talking about depersonalization. I don't know how big those research samples are, but could we combine the data sets people are experiencing depersonalization to create more powerful studies? I think we could. So that could be something to explore in the future for sure. So the last one is, who successfully rekindles old friendships? Friendships are one of the strongest contributors to our well-being, but they can be surprisingly fragile. Moving away, busy schedules, or major life changes mean most of us have a friend that we care about, but no longer keep in touch with. And research shows that even when we want to, we can still be hesitant to reach out. In combat psychology, sorry, I probably butchered that, Christina Costello and Laura Aiken asks who actually reaches out to lost friends and what is it that they say. Surprisingly, they find new variables that impact likelihood of reconnecting with old acquaintances, suggesting we are all capable of re-strengthening weakened bonds. So in future podcast episodes, I do want to cover this, and I do actually want to focus on it a bit more, especially if I do this communication psychology book, which I'm dabbling around with, even though it probably won't be released till 2027. Because I've got lots of other books on my to-do list first, because there's a lot of psychology research that I want to do, and lots of psychology topics that I want to explore. But this is really important. And like this week, I contacted an old friend of mine because I wanted to reconnect with him, and I was really proud of something that he did that I saw on like Instagram. So I wanted to like reach out and like congratulate him. He didn't reply, but I think the thought was still there. But I think this is a really interesting idea because, especially people from university, like for my undergraduate, there's lots of people who I was friends with, but I got busy, my mental health declined, I went through my trauma and everything else, so I lost contact with them and they didn't reach out to me either. So I think that if we could reconnect with older friendships, that would be really good, really valuable, and really insightful. Like I was listening to a podcast episode, a comedian podcast episode, and one of the people was mentioning how they connected with someone who they hadn't seen since grade 8, which is in Canada. So I don't know, I'm just going to pretend that that's like year 8 in the UK because I don't know how these grades work. And this comedian was saying how nice it was. So I think this is something that we should try and do, try and think about. So maybe a little exercise to do at the end of this psychology news article is think about your past, think about one old friend who you've lost contact with, and what would you say to them? What would you say to them if you suddenly saw them in the street and they said hello to you? What would you say? I think that would actually be a really fun exercise to do. So, I hope you enjoy the psychology news section. So let's move on to the personal update. So we're moving on to the personal update. I am really happy, and this week has just been really good for no particular reason, besides the fact that I've been getting a lot done. The job hunt still continues. So I've applied for like 10 jobs this week. Lots of them have been mental health related. Lots of them have been like trainee jobs. So if I get them, I get them. I really hope that I do. I really hope that I get an in to do. But if not, it's not the end of the world, and I will just keep applying. But in other news, I'm being really productive. I'm doing lots of really fun work on a whole wide range of different projects, and it just feels really good to be getting stuff done. Not only because I love being productive, but there's been one particular project that I have procrastinated so much about, and I have put on the back burner for so long that it's so unruly, it's so out of hand, and it's a bit ridiculous. But I thought, right, this week I'm gonna take a massive swing at it, and it's been so much fun just chip away at it, make allow myself to see a progress with it. And even though there's still quite a lot of like moving parts, it's just so much fun, and I feel so much lighter. And I didn't realize that this project was actually weighing on me a little bit. So really productive, and I got to see like family members. I got to see my like granddad because I like mowed his lawn today, and it's just lovely seeing people. So life is really good at the moment. Also, I've been learning a lot about learning disabilities this week for a future book, so it's been a lot of fun and really interesting for sure. So, as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and feelings on today's episode. So, you can always email me, connorwiley@connorwiley.net/podcast, and you can always tweet me on Twitter at sci-fi Wiley, or leave a comment on the Facebook post or LinkedIn post. And as always, I always love to hear your thoughts and opinions on today's episode, because it really helps make the podcast feel more like a conversation. And always feel free to send pictures of where you're listening in from. I always love to see where all of you are, all over the world. And today's episode has been sponsored by Healing as a Survivor. So this is a brilliant brand new book, and I will do a proper promotion podcast episode at some point forward. But this is the book that focuses on my specialist rape accounting. So it goes through each session about what we covered, how my week was before it, how it impacted me, and some of the stuff that I learned to help heal my sexual trauma. And the reason why this is the sponsor for today's podcast episode is because I talk about my suicide attempts and what the therapist did, and also what the counsellor should have reacted like, because they didn't react it that well, and I think she could have done stuff a bit better though. This is why I want to talk about it. I want to be open, and I want to educate others from my perspective as a suicide survivor and as a rape survivor. So it's really impactful. It's a brilliant book. I flat out love it, and I know you're going to learn so much from it. And this book really does show that healing from sexual trauma and healing from rape is possible. So it's a brilliant book. I cannot recommend it enough. So there's Healing as a Survivor, a personal and clinical psychology guide to healing from sexual violence. And it's available at all major ebook retailers, and you can order the paperback and the hardback version from Amazon, your local bookstore, or local library if you request it. And if you want the audiobook narrated by artificial intelligence, then now you can, at selected audiobook retailers like Spotify, Kobo, Google Play, and Barnes & Noble, and selected library systems like Overdrive, Bacon Taylor, and Biblioteca. So whilst buying books helps to support the creation and the editing of the podcast, my time is sponsored by my wonderful patrons. And as always, massive thank you to my patrons. Your support shows that you like the show and you want it to continue. And if you want access to tons of great rewards, including over 75 exclusive blog posts that won't be made into podcast episodes for weeks, months, or even years, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World podcast. Or if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Whiteley. So that's enough the personal update. Let's move on to the content part of today's episode. So we're moving on to the content part of today's episode. So we're going to be talking about what happens after surviving a suicide attempt. And also, before we dive into it, I just want to mention that, of course, nothing on this podcast is ever any sort of official advice. And please reach out to mental health service or suicide hotline if you're suicidal. So let's dive into it. What happens after surviving a suicide attempt? So the only silver lining that we can take from the topic of suicide is that there are a lot more suicide attempts than completed suicides. But this is nothing to bring comfort to all of us that have been impacted by suicide, because according to the United States Centers for Disease Control, in 2019 there were 47,500 completed suicide, compared to 1.4 million suicide attempts. And it's important to remember that suicide is greatly underreported. For example, my 3 suicide attempts in 2024 were not recorded or registered with any healthcare provider or similar agency. This suggests that less than 5% of suicide attempts are fatal. Personally, what's interesting about this statistic is that within clinical psychology, mental health, and wider society, there is a massive focus on suicide prevention and supporting the friends and families of loved ones that are left behind after a completed suicide. Yet there is very little teaching on what to do after a suicide attempt. Of course, as a suicide survivor myself, I understand that the focus absolutely has to be on prevention. In my experience, if the focus wasn't on prevention as much as it was, I would have tried to complete a successful suicide attempt way before 2024. Nonetheless, this lack of focus on what to do and how to support clients after a suicide attempt can lead to negative treatment of a client. For example, in my book Healing as a Survivor, I talk about how my specialist rape counsellor didn't react very well to my suicide revelation. It made me feel isolated, alone, and it didn't make me feel supported. Building upon this, people who attempt suicide and survive often require a lot of mental health support afterwards. Personally, I would highly recommend that the person who attempted suicide should definitely seek out mental health support so they can heal, get support, and find more adaptive ways to cope with life stresses. Another silver lining is that the research shows that whilst people who attempt suicide can continue to struggle with their mental health after an unsuccessful suicide attempt, the majority of these people do not try another suicide attempt. And the Center for Disease Control finds that more than 90% of people who survived a suicide attempt do not go on to die by suicide. Thankfully, that suggests there is hope for a great life after surviving a suicide attempt. How do survivors feel after a suicide attempt? So before I talk about what the research says, personally, after my 3 suicide attempts, I felt really depressed, annoyed, and slightly happy that I had been unsuccessful. I had wanted to kill myself because of my anxiety, my post-traumatic stress disorder, and all the other trauma responses that I was having after my rape. I had no quality of life. I believed that my life was beyond awful, and there was no way I would ever heal and get better. And I believed that my rapist had stolen everything from me. I firmly believed that the only way to stop the pain, the agony, and the trauma was just to kill myself. After I failed 3 times with different methods, I felt guilty that I had hurt my friends and my support system. I felt depressed because I was still hurting and in agony because of everything my rapist had done to me, and I felt isolated. Again, another symptom of depression. Building upon this, the emotions that a survivor experiences after surviving a suicide attempt can be wide ranging. Some survivors might be sad, others might feel relief, and others might feel anger or regret that they weren't successful. As well as there were some survivors that had immediately thoughts of trying a second attempt. Then they experienced feelings of relief because they survived. Personally, the gap between my first attempt and my second and third was about a week or two, and I think at first, after the suicide attempt, I felt relief and sad and isolation. Yet over time, as my mental health was still bad, my life still wasn't worth living as far as I was concerned, and I was still dealing with all the trauma responses. I just started to think more and more about the second and then third attempt. Some survivors feel guilt that they survived after the first suicide attempt because they believe that they are still a burden on others, and other survivors still believe that their suicide attempt allowed them to snap out of their suicidal thoughts and despair. In addition, some suicide survivors feel that they were given a new lease on life, and these survivors are typically able to return to their lives with a sense of gratitude. Personally, I feel like it took me months to reach the point in my life, and for the past few months, I have really been focusing on gratitude, being grateful to be alive, and just enjoying the small moments. For example, a few days ago, the sun was shining, the golden light looked really pretty on some vibrant green leaves, and I allowed myself to enjoy the pretty sight. I couldn't experience that simple moment of joy if I wasn't alive. On the other hand, other survivors are not so positive about their survival. Some people who experience a suicide attempt feel regret, depressed, and even disappointed after their survival. I think I went through a similar thing after my first suicide attempt. Thankfully, some research shows that these feelings will decrease for the majority of survivors, but they might indicate that the individual is still at risk of suicidal thoughts and future suicide attempts. This is why mental health support is so important. How to support someone after a suicide attempt? So, if a friend or family member or someone else you know has survived a suicide attempt, then you might be scared, confused, or angry at them. It is a normal and understandable reaction because you're scared that you'll lose someone you care about, love, and enjoy spending time with. I completely understand how scary this must be, because there have been plenty of people in my life who I would be devastated by if they had a successful suicide attempt, as well as if one of my friends or family members would try to end their life, then I would be scared for them. Additionally, after a suicide attempt, you might be asking yourself why did your friend or loved one try to end their life, or if there was something that you could have done to prevent it. Again, these are normal and good questions with no easy answers. Yet the most important thing that you can do for your friend or loved one is to provide them support, and being with them is often a key critical part of the process. Nonetheless, something I want to stress here is that you've got to look after yourself too, because as much as you want to love, support, and care about your friend who survived their suicide attempt, you've got to look after yourself. You are going to have to process your feelings, practice self care, put up boundaries, and manage your own health care too. Because believe me, please definitely believe me here. From personal experience as a suicide survivor, there is nothing worse than having someone you rely on, your mental health support, suddenly backing off because they didn't realize how bad your suicide attempt and your recovery was impacting them. That's really hurtful. And I'm pretty sure that's why I did my second and my third suicide attempt. Therefore, when you learn that your friend or loved one has survived a suicide attempt, it's important that you know that this isn't about saying the right thing. Of course, there are bad things to say and stuff you just shouldn't say. But in this moment in time, what your friend or loved one needs from you is your support. They need you to be there for them and just see what you're comfortable with. It's very unlikely that a friend or loved one wants to lose their autonomy, their freedom, or their ability to make decisions for themselves after a suicide attempt. This is why honest and open conversations between you and your loved one are so important. A practical yet unofficial tip might be to check in with the suicide survivor regularly. Tell them that you're thinking of them, and if the survivor wants to talk about the suicide attempt, then please make an effort to listen. Of course, this will be hard, it will be emotionally draining, and it might trigger some really difficult emotions for you. Yet, it's important in these situations to create an empathetic and non judgmental space, and definitely ask open ended questions, and give the survivor the space to sort through their difficult feelings after their suicide attempt. Something I realise now, looking back, is I didn't actually have a safe, empathetic space for me to deal with my emotions after my first suicide attempt. Again, this was probably a major reason why I did my second and my third suicide attempt. At the time, the people in my life were struggling with the realization that I had attempted suicide. They were backing off because of their own mental health. And when we did speak about it, I actually realized now I didn't feel safe enough to be completely vulnerable about why I wanted to kill myself. And as much as a particular friend said they were great at mental health talks, they weren't validating. They didn't ask me what I needed, and they focused on their fear, nothing to do with me. That only made me actually feel like more of a burden. And I distinctly remember writing in my book, Healing as a Survivor, either before or after the first suicide attempt, that I wanted to kill myself because I had hurt my friends. Anyway, when supporting a suicide survivor, you can ask him or her or them directly if they're thinking of hurting themselves again, and if they're struggling with suicidal thoughts. These are two good questions to ask because, as I discuss in suicide psychology, no one actually wants to commit suicide. No one actually wants to do a suicide attempt. We try to end our lives because we don't feel like there's another way out. Therefore, by asking these questions and tackling these topics head on, we're giving a suicidal person exactly what they want and need, a chance to talk about their feelings, their life, and hopefully you'll be able to find solutions together so a suicide attempt isn't needed. Furthermore, as you might imagine, expressing your anger towards the suicide survivor in your life isn't helpful, as it will only undermine your loved one's recovery, and it will add more so-called evidence to them that they're a burden. This is why it's important for you to find a more productive and healthier way to cope with your feelings, like talking to a therapist or a support group of friends or family members of suicide survivors, or another trusted friend or family member. One of the best things you could do for a suicide survivor is to manage your own complicated emotions so you can support the survivor in recovery without getting burnt out. The final set of unofficial tips is that you could help your survivor find a therapist or another form of mental health support, as well as encourage them to take part in exercise and other healthy habits. For example, getting plenty of sleep, self-care, and eating a balanced diet. How to get support after a suicide attempt. It's okay that you attempted suicide. There is no shame in it. I know what it's like to hate your life so much, see the world as such a dark and hopeless place, that death by suicide seems like the only way out. I also know that you to do a suicide attempt, and if you saw another way out, then you would have tried it. I know that suicide is always a last resort, and you can see it as a mercy to aren't a burden on your friends or family members anymore. And sometimes suicide can just seem like the best way to end all the awful pain that we experience on a daily basis. I understand it, as supported by my few suicide attempts. I'm so happy that I didn't, that I wasn't successful. I smile as I write this section, and even if I say this, because I'm really happy that I didn't kill myself in 2024. If I had killed myself, then I wouldn't have finished the clinical psychology masters that I flat out love. I wouldn't have met my beautiful ex, a partner, and we wouldn't have been able to enjoy our relationship whilst it lasted, and I wouldn't have been able to have sex for the first time. All of those life events seemed flat out impossible after my rape, and that's why I wanted to kill myself. Thankfully, my life is amazing, fun, and I'm so happy to be alive. Yet, I also know after a suicide attempt, life doesn't always feel great. As a result, after a suicide attempt, you might be feeling a lot of conflicting emotions, like I spoke about towards the beginning of the podcast episode. You might be annoyed or depressed that even after your suicide attempt, that you're still dealing with a lot of mental health struggles and social challenges that made you want to end your life by suicide in the first place. This is why I highly recommend that you reach out to mental health services after a suicide attempt. It will be scary. You might be nervous about being judged, and you might think that you'll be locked up forever if you reveal your suicide attempt to mental health services. Please reach out and get professional support, as it will be so important to your suicide recovery. Also, seek out support from your friends or loved ones, especially because after a suicide attempt, it can be so tempting to just shut yourself away from the world, hide in your bedroom, and cut everyone off out of shame or another emotion. The experts agree that after suicide, social connection is so important to your recovery. Also, your friends or loved ones are likely to be very worried about you and they want to help, so please reach out to them. Friends and family members can also be good sources of support if you tell them how you're hurting, how you're struggling, and what you need from them in turn. In the long term, it can be helpful for suicide survivors to find a sense of purpose and meaning, because this can help the survivors recover from despair. This is different for everyone. For example, as a podcaster and author, I find sharing my story, writing and learning to give me a lot of purpose, so I don't want to end my life by suicide. You might decide to do something completely different, because some research shows that the survivors who don't go on to die by suicide, they end up citing the desire to help others and contribute to society as important factors against further suicidal thoughts. Overall, finding meaning can be a critical step towards recovery. Conclusion. As dark as talking about suicide is, especially after the past year with my experience of 3 suicide attempts, I have to admit that I've really enjoyed today's podcast episode. Not only because, as I mentioned earlier, educating others and telling my story about suicide and how recovery is possible are protective factors against suicidal thoughts for me, but because this podcast episode helped me realize a few factors about my suicide attempt and how I didn't get the support I needed after my first suicide attempt, and that led me to my second and third. Ultimately, at the end of this episode, my message is clear. If you've survived a suicide attempt, then please reach out to mental health support services. And as a survivor myself, please know that healing, recovery, and thriving after a suicide attempt is possible. I have had so many fun experiences, from hanging out with friends, playing fun games, having sex, having a partner, writing great stories, reading wonderful books, and learning so many fascinating concepts that I flat out love being alive. I couldn't have done any of these experiences if my suicide attempts were successful. Therefore, I know how hard it is, I know how much pain you're in, and I know how much easier it is to simply end it all. But please, reach out to mental health support, start your recovery journey, and let your friends and family members support you. Life gets better. So, I really hope that you enjoyed today's episode and you got something out of it. I know the idea was, like I said, this makes me feel really alive, it makes me feel really happy. I'm really glad and sort of life affirming to do these podcast episodes. When I can draw on my personal experiences, I can hopefully help others. And this information is out there, so hopefully it can spark conversations. It can be a resource that helps people, and it might even save a life or two. And if you know anyone who would enjoy today's episode, then please share it with them. I'm always really grateful when you wonderful people help spread the word about the podcast. And if you want to learn more, please check out Healing as a Survivor, available in all digital places. It's a brilliant book, and it really does help you to understand what I was going through at that time and what led to my suicide attempts and what happens afterwards for me. And if you want to support the podcast on a monthly basis, then please head on over to patreon.com/the Psychology World podcast. And if you want to support the podcast on a one-off basis, then now you can at buymeacoffee.com/Connor Wiley. So have a great day, everyone, and I'll see you next time. Found it helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your favourite podcast app. And if you wanted to learn more, then please check out the backlist of the podcast episodes or my books at conwiley.net. So have a great day, and I'll see you next time.